Mother-in-law changed my baby's name. While I was in surgery, it's a felony. The day my mother-in-law tried to rewrite my child's identity. Your name choice was terrible, dear. I picked something much better while you were unconscious. Those were the first words my mother-in-law Margaret said to me as I slowly came out of the anesthesia fog, still connected to monitors and IV drips after emergency surgery that saved both my life and my newborn daughter's. My name is Claire Murphy. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a legal document specialist for Morrison & Associates law firm in Portland, Oregon. In that sterile hospital room at 3:47 p.m. on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I discovered that someone had committed federal forgery using my identity while I was fighting for my life on an operating table. I simply nodded and asked the nurse for some water. My voice was still hoarse from the breathing tube, but my mind was crystal clear. 22 hours of labor had turned into an emergency C-section when my daughter's heart rate dropped dangerously low. While surgeons worked to save us both, someone had apparently taken the liberty of making decisions about my child's legal identity. The birth certificate in my hands showed a name I had never chosen. Margaret Rose Murphy, instead of the Emma Claire Murphy that my husband David and I had carefully selected months ago. "Where's David?" I asked calmly, though something cold was settling in my chest. My husband should have been the one holding our daughter's birth certificate, the one making decisions if I couldn't. The nurse informed me he had stepped out to make some calls, and that his mother had been so helpful with all the paperwork, while the family was stressed about my condition. Margaret beamed proudly from her chair beside my bed, holding my daughter like a trophy. That's when I knew exactly what I was dealing with. You see, when you work in legal documentation for 5 years, you understand the gravity of official paperwork. Birth certificates aren't suggestions or rough drafts. They're federal documents that establish a person's legal identity. Changing information on a birth certificate without parental consent isn't a family disagreement. It's document fraud, identity theft, and potentially several other felonies carrying sentences of up to 3 years in federal prison. But I didn't say any of that. I just smiled weakly and told Margaret how thoughtful she was, how lucky we were to have such a caring grandmother. Her satisfied smirk told me everything I needed to know about her intentions and character. She had violated federal law because she assumed I was too weak, too grateful, and too intimidated to do anything about it. She was wrong on all 3 counts. Let me tell you about the Margaret I thought I knew. When David first introduced us, 3 years ago, she seemed like the perfect future mother-in-law. Margaret Williams was a 58-year-old retired bank manager who had raised David as a single mother after his father died when he was 12. She appeared devoted, protective, and eager to welcome me into their small family. She had opinions about everything: our wedding plans, our apartment choice, our career decisions. But I interpreted her input as caring involvement, not controlling manipulation. David and I met at a coffee shop near the courthouse where I often grabbed lunch between client meetings. He was there grading papers, he teaches high school history, and we struck up a conversation about a legal drama he was watching on his laptop. 6 months later, he proposed with his grandmother's ring, and Margaret cried happy tears as she welcomed me to the family, or so I thought. The first red flag I ignored was during our wedding planning. Margaret had strong opinions about everything from the venue to my dress to the guest list. When I mentioned wanting to honor my deceased mother by incorporating her maiden name, Claire, as our future daughter's middle name, Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, honey," she said sweetly, "don't you think that's a bit old-fashioned? My name would be much more meaningful for a little girl." I laughed it off as typical mother-in-law boundary testing. The second red flag was during my pregnancy. Margaret began referring to my unborn daughter as my grandbaby, in a way that felt possessive rather than loving. She made comments about how she couldn't wait to fix any parenting mistakes David and I might make, since she had successfully raised one child already. When David gently reminded her that we were the parents, she would laugh and say she was just excited to help. The third and final red flag I should have recognized was her reaction when we told her we had chosen the name Emma Claire Murphy. Her face went cold for exactly 3 seconds before she recovered and said, "Well, if that's what you really want." But then she spent the next 20 minutes explaining why Margaret was a much stronger name for a modern girl, and how Claire sounded dated and boring. David changed the subject, but I noticed how she never used our chosen name again, always referring to the baby or my grandbaby. Now, lying in that hospital bed, I realized these hadn't been red flags at all. They had been warnings about someone who genuinely believed she had more rights to my child than I did. Margaret had planned this. She had waited for the perfect moment when I would be vulnerable, unconscious, and unable to stop her. She had committed multiple felonies not in a moment of emotional confusion, but as a calculated power play to establish dominance over my family. I spent the next 2 hours playing the grateful, weak new mother, while my mind cataloged exactly what laws had been broken and how to document everything. Margaret continued chatting about her excellent name choice and how everyone at the hospital had complimented her on being such a take-charge grandmother. She even mentioned how she had corrected the nurse when they asked about the name, explaining that Claire and David had changed their minds and specifically requested Margaret as the first name. This was key information. She hadn't claimed it was a mistake or that she misunderstood our wishes. She had explicitly told hospital staff that we had made this decision, which meant she had knowingly provided false information to federal documents officers. Some might call that detailed planning. I call it evidence. When David returned around 6 p.m., his face was flushed with excitement about becoming a father, but I could see something else in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that suggested he knew something was wrong. His mother immediately launched into praise for her own decision-making while he was dealing with insurance calls and parking. She handed him the birth certificate like she was presenting an award she had won. David looked at the paper, looked at me, looked at his mother, and I watched the exact moment he understood what had happened. "Mom," he said slowly, "this isn't the name we chose." Margaret waved dismissively and explained that she had improved our choice while we were too stressed to think clearly. She reminded him that she had more experience with important decisions and that he should be grateful she had stepped up during a crisis. "I need to speak with my wife alone," David said quietly. His mother looked annoyed but gathered her purse, reminding us both that she would be back first thing in the morning to help with more decisions. After she left, David sat heavily in the chair beside my bed and put his head in his hands. "Claire, I am so sorry. I had no idea she was planning something like this. I was dealing with insurance and calling your sister, and I thought she was just sitting with you." I squeezed his hand and told him we would fix it together. But David didn't fully understand what we were dealing with yet. He thought this was a family boundary issue that could be resolved with a firm conversation and maybe some paperwork corrections. He didn't comprehend that his mother had committed federal crimes that could result in prison time. I didn't enlighten him that evening. I needed time to think, to plan, and to document everything properly. That night, after David had gone home, to get some rest before bringing me discharge papers in the morning, I used my phone to research the exact legal framework we were dealing with. What Margaret had done violated at least 4 federal statutes: document fraud, 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1341, identity theft, 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1028, fraudulent use of identification documents, 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1028A, and conspiracy to commit fraud, 18 U.S.C., paragraph 371. Each carried potential sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years in federal prison. But here's what she didn't know about me. Before working at Morrison & Associates, I had spent 2 years working for the Oregon Secretary of State's office in their fraud investigation division. I had personally processed over 200 cases involving forged documents, identity theft, and fraudulent birth certificates. I knew exactly which federal agents to contact, which forms to file, and how to build an airtight case for prosecution. More importantly, I understood something Margaret couldn't have anticipated. Hospitals are required by federal law to keep detailed records of everyone who interacts with birth certificate documentation. There would be security camera footage of her filling out forms. There would be time-stamped records of her conversations with staff. There would be documented evidence of exactly what she told them and when. She had committed these crimes in one of the most surveilled, documented environments possible. I made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to my former supervisor at the Secretary of State's office, who confirmed that this was indeed a federal matter and gave me the direct number for the FBI's white-collar crime division. The second was to my current boss at Morrison & Associates, who immediately offered the firm's full legal support and reminded me that we had recently handled 2 similar cases involving fraudulent vital records. The third call was to my sister Jennifer, who is a social worker specializing in family law and who had never trusted Margaret's helpful tendencies. By morning, I had a comprehensive plan. I would not confront Margaret directly or try to handle this as a family dispute. I would treat it exactly like what it was, a federal crime committed against my family by someone who had assumed they could manipulate the legal system without consequences. I would document everything, preserve all evidence, and let the federal justice system handle someone who thought identity theft was an acceptable way to get what she wanted. David arrived at 9 a.m. with coffee, flowers, and genuine excitement about taking our daughter home. I waited until after the discharge nurse had left to show him the research I had compiled overnight. I watched his face change as he read through the federal statutes Margaret had violated and understood that this wasn't a family misunderstanding that could be resolved with better communication. "You're telling me my mother could go to prison for this?" he asked quietly, looking at our sleeping daughter. I nodded and explained that document fraud involving federal vital records was taken extremely seriously by law enforcement, especially when it involved identity theft of a minor child. "But David," I said gently, "this is bigger than just changing a name. Your mother believed she had the right to make legal decisions about our child without our consent. She planned this while I was unconscious and fighting for my life. This was calculated, not impulsive." David's hands were shaking as he held the birth certificate. "What do we do?" I told him we were going to let the appropriate authorities handle someone who had committed federal crimes, and that we were going to protect our family from anyone who thought our legal parental rights were optional. He nodded slowly and asked what I needed from him. I realized in that moment that I had married the right person, someone who could recognize right from wrong even when it involved his own mother. At 11:30 a.m., Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division arrived at the hospital to take my initial statement. Agent Chen was a 15-year veteran who specialized in document fraud cases, and she immediately understood the severity of what had occurred. "Mrs. Murphy," she said after reviewing my compiled evidence, "this is one of the most clear-cut cases of birth certificate fraud I've encountered. Most people who commit these crimes try to hide their actions. Your mother-in-law seems to have documented her involvement extensively." Agent Chen was right. Margaret had signed multiple hospital forms, spoken to numerous staff members, and even taken photos of herself holding the corrected birth certificate to post on social media. She had created a comprehensive evidence trail of her own criminal activity because she genuinely believed what she was doing was legal and appropriate. She had no understanding that parental rights are protected by federal law, specifically to prevent this type of identity manipulation. The hospital's security office provided Agent Chen with over 4 hours of footage showing Margaret filling out forms, speaking with staff, and explicitly representing herself as someone authorized to make these decisions. The audio was particularly damning. She could be heard telling a records clerk that the parents had specifically requested these changes, and that she was handling the paperwork because they were too exhausted to deal with details. By 2 p.m., we had a comprehensive federal case file documenting multiple felonies. Agent Chen explained that the U.S. Attorney's Office would review the case within 48 hours, and that federal charges would likely be filed within the week. She also informed me that restitution would include all legal costs associated with correcting the fraudulent documentation, which could amount to several $1,000s in attorney fees and court costs. We went home that afternoon with our daughter Emma Claire Murphy, whose correct birth certificate would be reissued within 10 business days once the fraud investigation was complete. Margaret had called David 6 times, leaving voicemails about coming over to help with the baby and to discuss any concerns we might have about her assistance with the hospital paperwork. David didn't return her calls. On Thursday morning, Margaret arrived unannounced at our apartment with bags of baby supplies and a homemade casserole. She breezed past David when he opened the door, chattering about her excitement to spend time with little Margaret and her plans for helping us adjust to parenthood. She had apparently spent $400 at Baby World and expected to be welcomed with gratitude for her continued helpfulness. I was sitting on the couch, still recovering from major surgery, when she bustled in and immediately tried to take Emma from my arms. "Let Grandma hold her precious little Margaret," she cooed, reaching for my daughter. I held Emma closer and said calmly, Her name is Emma Claire, and I'm not comfortable with visitors right now. Margaret's smile faltered, and she looked at David like he should correct my confusion. Now, Claire, honey, I know you're tired and probably still affected by all those medications, but we discussed this at the hospital. Margaret is a much better name than Emma, and everyone agreed it was the right choice. She was using the same condescending tone someone might use with a confused elderly person, as if my objection to identity theft was a symptom of postpartum confusion rather than a rational response to federal crimes. David stepped forward and told his mother she needed to leave. Mom, you changed our daughter's legal name without our permission while Claire was unconscious. That's not helping. That's criminal. Margaret laughed and said David was being dramatic and that she had simply stepped up when we were too overwhelmed to make good decisions. She genuinely seemed to believe that committing identity theft was a form of childcare assistance. At exactly 3:17 p.m., there was a knock on our door. Agent Chen stood outside with 2 other federal agents and a warrant for Margaret's arrest. I watched through our window as they explained to Margaret that she was being charged with multiple federal felonies related to document fraud and identity theft. The expression on her face was one of complete shock, not guilt or remorse, but genuine surprise that there were legal consequences for her actions. Margaret immediately began explaining to the agents that there had been a misunderstanding and that she was just helping family during a stressful time. Agent Chen later told me that Margaret seemed truly bewildered by the arrest, repeatedly asking why helping with paperwork was being treated like a crime. She apparently asked if she could speak to a supervisor who would understand that she was an experienced mother who had better judgment than her son and daughter-in-law. David was devastated watching his mother being arrested, but he never wavered in supporting our decision to press charges. She did this to herself, Claire, he said as we watched the agent's car pull away. She committed crimes against our family and genuinely thought we should be grateful. I don't recognize the person who could do something like that to us. I realized that Margaret's actions had revealed aspects of her character that David had never seen before, or that he had seen but interpreted differently. Margaret's arraignment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Her court-appointed attorney immediately began pushing for a plea bargain, explaining to her that federal document fraud cases were typically prosecuted to the full extent of the law and that she was facing 3 to 5 years in federal prison, if convicted on all charges. Margaret apparently told her attorney that she wanted to represent herself because no one understood that she had been protecting her granddaughter from poor parenting decisions. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Ross, had a 94% conviction rate on federal fraud cases and had seen similar crimes involving family members who believed their opinions superseded legal parental rights. Mrs. Murphy, he told me, during our pretrial meeting, your mother-in-law created one of the most documented cases of birth certificate fraud I've prosecuted. She committed multiple felonies in a federal facility while creating extensive video and audio evidence of her criminal intent. This case will likely be resolved with a guilty plea within 30 days. But Margaret refused to accept a plea bargain. She insisted on going to trial because she wanted to explain to a jury that she had been saving her granddaughter from a terrible name choice, and that her actions were motivated by love and experience. Her court-appointed attorney eventually withdrew from the case after Margaret repeatedly ignored legal advice and insisted that federal judges would understand her grandmother's intuition once she had a chance to explain herself properly. During the 3-day trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Margaret's crimes. Security footage of her filling out fraudulent forms, audio recordings of her lying to hospital staff, documented proof that she had researched the hospital's birth certificate process in advance, and her own social media posts celebrating her successful intervention in our parenting decisions. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all 4 federal counts. Judge Patricia Williams, no relation, sentenced Margaret to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, $12,000 in restitution to cover our legal costs and document correction fees, and 200 hours of community service working with identity theft victims. During sentencing, Judge Williams noted that Margaret had shown no remorse for violating federal law and continued to demonstrate a concerning disregard for basic parental rights and legal boundaries. Margaret's final statement to the court was that she still believed she had made the right choice for everyone involved. and that she hoped we would eventually understand that she had been protecting Emma from parents who didn't appreciate good advice. Even facing federal prison time, she maintained that identity theft was an acceptable form of grandparental involvement. The most telling moment came during David's victim impact statement. He told the court that his mother's actions had violated the most fundamental trust between family members and had forever changed how I understand her character and judgment. He explained that she had chosen to commit federal crimes rather than respect our parental rights, and that her complete lack of remorse had made it impossible to maintain a relationship with her. Emma Claire Murphy is now 6 months old, and her corrected birth certificate hangs in a frame in her nursery, right next to her first ultrasound photo. Margaret writes letters from federal prison asking when she can meet her granddaughter Margaret, and explaining how prison has given her time to plan better ways to help with parenting decisions when she's released. David throws the letters away without reading them to me anymore. The most profound impact of this experience has been understanding how someone can commit serious crimes while genuinely believing they're helping. Margaret didn't wake up one day and decide to be malicious. She gradually developed a belief system where other people's legal rights were less important than her personal preferences. She crossed every possible boundary because she had convinced herself that her judgment was more valuable than our autonomy. I've learned that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones most willing to violate our fundamental rights to get what they want. Margaret stole our daughter's identity not because she was evil, but because she believed her desires were more important than federal law, our parental rights, and our family's autonomy. That's a special kind of selfishness that can only be addressed through legal consequences, not family discussions. Today, Emma Claire is a happy, healthy baby who will grow up knowing that her grandmother chose prison rather than respecting her parents' rights. She'll understand that some people consider their opinions more important than other people's legal boundaries, and that protecting yourself from those people sometimes requires federal intervention. She'll learn that standing up to family members who commit crimes isn't betrayal, it's self-protection. David sometimes wonders if we should have handled this differently, if there was a way to address his mother's behavior without involving law enforcement. I remind him that we tried family communication for 3 years while she systematically violated our boundaries and built up to committing federal crimes. People don't forge federal documents because they've run out of reasonable options. They commit identity theft because they believe rules don't apply to them. The strangest part of this entire experience has been Margaret's continued belief that she was the victim of our overreaction to her helpfulness. Even from federal prison, she writes about how she was just trying to improve a poor decision and how we've destroyed the family by refusing to forgive a grandmother's love. She has never acknowledged that identity theft is a crime, that parents have legal rights, or that her actions caused harm to anyone. Sometimes people show you who they really are in moments when they think there won't be consequences. Margaret showed us that she's someone who believes her opinions are more important than federal law, our parental rights, and our family's autonomy. She chose to commit multiple felonies rather than respect boundaries, and then chose prison rather than accept responsibility for criminal behavior. Emma Claire Murphy exists as herself, not as someone else's vision of who she should be, because her parents understood that some violations require legal consequences, not family tolerance. She'll grow up knowing that identity matters, that boundaries exist for important reasons, and that people who truly love you don't steal fundamental aspects of who you are, even if they think they know better. Margaret will be released from federal prison in 8 months, but she'll never have unsupervised access to our family again. Some people earn their way out of relationships by demonstrating that their love comes with conditions that include violating your legal rights. Emma deserves to grow up around people who understand that identity theft isn't a form of family assistance, regardless of the intentions behind it. That's the story of how my mother-in-law got 3 years of federal consequences for thinking she knew better than federal law, parental rights, and basic human decency. Emma Claire Murphy, the name we chose, the identity we protected, is sleeping peacefully in her crib, surrounded by people who understand that loving someone means respecting who they are, not rewriting who you think they should be.